Okay, hello once again. Here's our second one. Let's get to it. PowerPoint, 20th century. Let's start the slideshow. It's a beautiful day outside. Hoping to get out there and mow the lawn. So this lecture is on three different perspectives: the Freudians, the behaviorists, and the humanists. We're going to call them the 20th century perspectives. That categorization of 20th century is loose. The other three we talked about definitely lapped over into the 20th century, but these three span pretty much the entire century, so they make more sense to be called that. One of the things we're going to do is talk about them in terms of nature or nurture and their view on which was dominant in us. So just to make sure you understand that idea, the key question for this lecture is, which is more important in determining who we are and how we behave, nature or nurture? Which shapes us more? Nature would, of course, be the influence of our inherited genes, our innate self that we are born with through our DNA. Nurture would be what happens to us, the influence of our surroundings and all our life experiences. Okay, let's start in with Freud. That's Sigmund Freud. He is from Vienna, Austria, and is kind of turn of the century, made his mark probably in the very early 1900s. He's a physician and a neurologist, and belongs in the pantheon of great thinkers in modern human history, with Darwin and Marx and Einstein. And that's not to say that we still accept all the stuff that he came up with. It's just that he was creative and brilliant and saw the world, meaning humans, in a new way and had a long, long-lasting impact. Out of those four, Darwin and Einstein's theories, well, they've been adapted and modernized, still stick with us. Freud, and you could argue about Marx, has mostly been discarded. Modern psychology really doesn't use Freud's theories very much, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Freud was profoundly influenced by Charles Darwin, who came about a generation earlier, and Darwin's ideas about evolution and natural selection. And he took that and developed the idea of humans as being a mix of nature and nurture. And he said both things are in us. I love that slide. So he said nature and nurture for him is very much a versus. It's a brutal clash between the Wolverine inside us, our savage nature, and the civilizing influence of society. So he said our nature is aggressive and animalistic, like the Wolverine, and the nurture is society serves to kind of civilize us, and that inside us there's a clash between those two pieces of us. Freud treated patients, many of them middle and upper class Viennese women, and the most common diagnosis he had was hysteria. To develop his theories, he went deeply into individual cases. That's known, as you probably know, as the case study method. The case study method is a very useful and significant way to do research. We'll talk at the end of this about how Freud kind of took it on the wrong track. He developed a theory of the mind, theory of personality, theories of motivations and behavior, theories of mental disorder and how to treat it. He really the first comprehensive theories about human psychology as a whole. The modern term for people who are still follow his theories is psychodynamic theory. To do Freudian treatment on someone and therapy is called psychoanalysis, and you probably have heard of that term. we're going to talk about briefly about his theory of the mind. He said it had three parts: the id, ego, and superego. And I'm going to skip to the next slide, but I'll come back to this one. He said that we are born with an id, and we are born with these kind of animalistic urges. That's all we have is urges. A baby wants things. If she's hungry, she cries. She has no sense of the external world, of others, of reality or consciousness. No kind of awareness. So all a baby is wanting things, unconscious urges. That's the id. About 2 years old, another part of the mind gradually develops. We become aware that we can't always get what we want, kind of like the Rolling Stones saying. And that is when your ego develops. Now, Freud's meaning of the word ego is different from how we kind of use it loosely today, where we say, he's got a big ego. We mean, he thinks a lot of himself. Freud's ego is very different. The ego for him is like the agent or the middleman. He's the guy who gets you things, deals with the real world, and is part of our conscious mind. If you see a toy as a 2-year-old in a store, you can't just grab it. You have to ask. If you see a nice hunky guy walking down the street, you can't just grab him. You have to ask. Unless, of course, you're Donald Trump and celebrities, they just get to grab things. The id works off the pleasure principle. If it feels good, do it. The ego works off the reality principle. What's possible? What can I get away with? There's no real morality. It's just a question of what's realistic, what's possible. All this time, you have your parents, you have siblings, you have the rest of the world telling you what to do, the rules of what's right and wrong. And eventually, in one form or another, you come to believe those rules. You internalize them. When you really take them in and make them, they become a part of you, part of your mind, you have developed a third part of your mind, the superego. The superego is like a conscience, but not exactly. It's a little different because it contains other things. For example, in Freud's conception, the superego, you have a vision of yourself as you want to be, or as you wished you were, your ideal self. It's a little more complicated than just a conscience telling you what's right and wrong. Back to the iceberg. For Freud, some of your mind was part of the conscious world, and you could be aware of, and some of it you couldn't really be aware of directly. It would come out in your behavior or in twisted ways, and especially in your dreams, but it was part of the unconscious. And so you see that the id is entirely unconscious, whereas the ego and superego are in both worlds. And now you have that nature and nurture and conflict that I mentioned at the beginning of this. Your primal urges is your id, is balanced by your superego, your sense of what you should do. And the ego mediates between the two. When you don't satisfy your urges, that can lead to trouble. How you resolve this conflict between what you want and what you should do determines whether you kind of are healthy or unhealthy mentally. And everybody kind of deals with things in a mix of healthy and unhealthy ways. And to deal with them in an unhealthy way can lead to neuroses or being neurotic. Freud introduced a ton of different ideas, many of which have stuck with us, especially in popular, the mainstream world, more so than in psychology. But his three big contributions would be really developing the idea of an unconscious mind. He's the first to really probe that and develop that idea, and we still very much believe in an unconscious mind. Many students find his ideas very compelling and appealing. They make a lot of sense. In the end, though, his flaws are probably bigger than the ideas, and the modern version of the unconscious mind is very, very different from that cesspool of urges and desires that Freud saw. So, but he did give us the unconscious. He also is the first to really say we are a mix of nature and nurture. Now, his version is different, again, from the modern conception. His was very much nature versus nurture. Now we think of it more as like a partnership, nature and nurture together. But he did give us that. And then something still very, very important is his idea that we're all a little bit neurotic, that mental disorders are a spectrum is very much a trendy idea and kind of dominates current thinking. That we're all a little disordered, some of us more mildly than others, some of us more severely, but that it's a spectrum, not an either or, is very much a Freudian idea. So I would say he gave us those three big ideas along with some others. His weaknesses were he overemphasized the kind of sexual and aggressive urges we have. And that's where our modern view of the unconscious mind is different. And that is where a lot of his former proteges broke with him. His theory is also very unscientific. It's difficult to test and measure his theory of the id, ego, and superego. What research he did do, those case studies, also is called into question, the validity of his actual evidence, because he based his theories based on just a few case studies of not necessarily people who were representative of the larger population. And so those would be the three big criticisms of him. Again, I want to emphasize that case studies are a very valid method of study, like Oliver Sacks, studying remarkable people who either, remarkable in their abilities or are unusual for what they have lost, like Jimmy G and his memory, can teach us a lot about the human mind and behavior. And studying people like Jimmy G did teach us a lot about how memory works by studying somebody in whom it doesn't work very well. And that's so case studies are a very valid research method, but by themselves they're not really enough to build a theory off of, because you can't really test your theory off of a case study. And that's the flaw in Freud's methods. We will go back over that when we study research methods. It's a whole unit, but you should keep in mind that idea of what a case study is and how Freud misused them versus how somebody like Oliver Sacks used them properly. And I'll just mention the Neo-Freudians who broke with him. On the bottom right, that's all Alfred Adler. Here, this is Karen Horney. This is, I believe, Anna Freud, his daughter, who developed a lot of his theories, including the idea of many of his defense mechanisms. This is Erik Erikson, maybe my favorite of the Neo-Freudians. I really like his theories a lot. Erich Fromm and Carl Jung. And we will talk about all of them in the personality unit, and Fromm just a tiny bit later on. So you don't need to really remember their names now. I might put a question on where you have to recognize them. You don't have to know much about what they thought, just that they were Neo-Freudians, and they broke with Freud primarily because they thought they were the first to make some of those criticisms, especially that he focused too much on childhood and sexual and aggressive urges. All right, let's move on from behaviorism, or to behaviorism. In the 20s, counter-movement develops that's a reaction to psychoanalysis. This movement was begun by John Watson, this guy on the left, and continued by B.F. Skinner, the guy on the right. They reject his findings and his theories, and they reject his methods. And they're the first successfully scientific group. They reject, all of those earlier groups as approaching study of human psychology in the wrong way. They said you cannot properly study mental activity scientifically, so don't even bother. The only thing you can properly study would be behavior, and that's why they are called behaviorists. Before I get into them, though, I have to go back a little bit to a group I skipped called the Associationists, who are their predecessors. And that's three guys, Hermann Ebbinghaus, Edward Thorndike, and Ivan Pavlov. The associationists, very briefly, we'll talk about them again in a later unit called the learning unit, focused on how events or ideas become associated in our minds. The idea that if you put your hand to a hot stove and it burns you, that you learn not to do that, that you associate putting your hand to the hot stove with burning. That's learning. And for them, they're called associationists because it's the idea how we associate two things together. Ebbinghaus, in the late 1800s, studied memory, and especially how repetitious practice affected recall. Edward Thorndike, in the early 1900s, proposed something called the law of effect, that over time, actions that get rewarded are strengthened, even if those actions are unintentional. But by far the most important of the associationists was a man you know, Ivan Pavlov, a Russian in the late 1800s and early 1900s, right around the time of Freud. He was a physiologist who was studying digestion. He had no interest in psychology. This is an example of curiosity being an important element of a successful researcher, and how when things go wrong or unexpected findings happen, a very good thinker won't just dismiss them. They actually are drawn to those and are curious to try and figure out, hey, why did that go wrong, or what happened? And some of the most important psychological breakthroughs came through unexpected findings or things, quote, going wrong. Pavlov's study of dogs is one of them. So he's studying dogs and salivation, and he does a whole contraption where he operates on the dogs and diverts their salivary glands he externalizes them so that when the dog salivates, he can collect all the saliva or drool in those tubes there. That's a model of a dog and the tube that Pavlov used. While he was studying digestion in the dogs, he realized they were beginning to salivate even before they began eating. And he was puzzled by this. Why would that happen? And so he begins to investigate that, and over many years does a wide number of investigations of this salivary reflex and how he can condition it or train it. So he trained them to salivate based on something totally unrelated to food, a metronome, a bell, the sight of the researcher ready to feed them in a lab coat. He called this conditioned reflex, and this process of associating two things in an organism's mind is called classical conditioning. It's involuntary and unthinking. Pavlov's work leads to Watson and then eventually to Skinner. So talk about John Watson. That's a photo of him with the very famous Little Albert experiments. Watson had a very different take on the nature-nurture debate than Freud. He thought that the structuralists and Freud were unscientific, as I said, and thought that while nature may play a role in who you are, you couldn't properly study it, and he thought nurture was far more important. So he entirely ignored the nature side and said, we are pretty much all nurture. He didn't totally believe that, but he mostly did. What he did believe was nurture, the environment, is the only thing you can control and thus scientifically study, because you can manipulate the environment and you can observe the behavior. Here's a quote from Watson. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar, man, and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. So that's the nurture argument, that he can take anybody and turn him into anything. What is often left off of the quote is the next part, where he says, I am going beyond my facts, and I admit it. But so have the advocates of the contrary side, and they've been doing it for many thousands of years. So he pushed an argument that he didn't really fully believe, but he did believe that to be scientific you could only study behavior. Watson's most famous for the little Albert experiment, in which he conditioned young baby, little Albert, to fear a white rat, and that's shown there. Skinner follows in the mid-century and develops a new kind of conditioning called operant conditioning. Some of you may have read about him in the summer reading. Skinner worked with rats and pigeons, but then took what he found with them and extended it to develop a theory of behavior to humans. The differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning are, in classical, the events are external. The organism learns to associate two external events, like a metronome and food appearing, and then has an involuntary reaction to it, drooling. In operant conditioning, the organism's own behavior is shaped through reinforcement. Organisms choose to do a certain action because it gets rewarded or reinforced. For Skinner, the focus is almost entirely on observable and measurable behavior. Behaviorism is the dominant perspective in psych for the mid part of the century, from like the 30s through the 60s. More so than Freud and those earlier perspectives, it's still influential today. The others died out because their methods were not scientific enough or their conclusions were too vague. Behaviorism has a very solid foundation of evidence, so it's never really been disproven. Operant conditioning, classical conditioning definitely work. It just came to be seen as incomplete. So what should you know for behaviorism? You should know about the importance of Pavlov and a brief understanding of what classical conditioning was. You should understand their focus, what CC and OC were, the scientific basis of the methods, their view of nature and nurture, and its continued relevance today. And the weakness would be just that it is only a partial perspective. It doesn't explain anything about the internal workings of the mind. And modern psychology and the cognitive revolution, we'll talk about on Monday, has kind of come back to that focus on, there's a lot going on that we're not conscious of. There's a lot, and we understand mental processes better than Skinner or Watson would have said we could. 22 minutes here, and I'm almost finished. Humanism. Rogers and Maslow. That's Carl Rogers on the left and Abraham Maslow on the right. In the late 60s and 70s, a lot is going on in America and the world. You have the Civil Rights Revolution, you have the Vietnam War, you have the counterculture, you have Woodstock, and socially, society's in an upheaval. And that's not just in the U.S., that happened worldwide. So in that era of dramatic change, it washes over into psychology. And that is true generally. Psychology and other fields, history, etc., don't operate in a vacuum. What is being thought of and worked on at the time is a function of the larger currents of society. And so psych is both affected by that and goes back and in turn affects society. The pictures of Rogers and Maslow, you probably noticed these are much happier guys than Watson and Skinner. And that is reflected in their perspective, their theory. They reject Freud's focus on savage urges or instinct. They reject Skinner's focus on animals and this kind of very simplistic psychology on rewards and punishments. And they focus on the uniqueness of each individual. Each individual is unique and special. That's a very 70s kind of ideology. They, in contrast to Skinner, who thought that human behavior can be entirely manipulated by the outside, thought that humans have free will and can exercise their own independent judgment. And in contrast to Freud, they thought we do have a nature, but that we're essentially good. And that the environment can work to either promote our innate self that could essentially be productive and positive, or hinder it and thwart it and turn it into something that's not. So for them, people who are struggling or unsuccessful or bad could have been good and can go back and kind of reconnect with that inner self, their true self. It's a very optimistic and positive view of humanity. and appeals to a lot of people. It was a needed kind of corrective to the cold analytical behaviorism, but again, it's kind of a vague and difficult theory to test. How do you test if somebody's essentially good? So it has its limitations too, and I would say behaviorism has had more of a long-lasting impact than humanism. Their methods were more holistic and qualitative. They used diaries and questionnaires and informal interviews. One of the areas where it's still around is it did lead to something called the positive psychology movement, which is the kind of scientific study of how to improve ourselves and our outlook on life. And that is actually a fairly strong movement nowadays. This is not something you need to know for the test Tuesday, but that is just to kind of introduce it. That is Maslow's pyramid called the hierarchy of needs. And the things, and he said we focus on the bottom ones first, and then only when we've met those can we move up the hierarchy. This is his original hierarchy. There's a more modern one. What do you need to know for them? I kind of went through that all already. Why they rejected Freud and the behaviorists, how they saw the nature versus nurture debate, what they thought about humans and kind of the essence of the theory, and then the methods they used, and why it kind of has faded out a little bit. That's it. If you have any questions about any of this, I'll see you in class tomorrow. Hopefully you can watch these Sunday night and come into class knowing about it tomorrow, and we'll talk tomorrow. Good luck. Have a good rest of the weekend. Bye.